It was supposed to be a day of silence. Across Israel, radios were quiet, streets deserted. Families gathered for Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day of fasting, reflection, and atonement. Even the Israeli Defense Forces were at minimal alert, their soldiers home or in synagogues. Then, at 2 p.m., the ground trembled, sirens screamed, fighter jets streaked across the sky. The unthinkable had begun. Egyptian forces, more than 200,000 troops, surged across the Suez Canal, blasting through the sand ramparts of the Bar-Lev line, Israel's supposedly impregnable defense wall. On the northern front, Syria unleashed a massive assault on the Golan Heights, sending over 1,000 tanks thundering toward Israeli positions. The Yom Kippur War, or the October War, as it's called in the Arab world, had begun. For Israel, it was a nightmare. For the Arab world, it was a moment of long-awaited retribution. But 50 years later, the question still echoes: who truly won? The ghost of 1967. To understand this war, we must look back 6 years earlier, to June 1967, the Six-Day War. In just 6 days, Israel had crushed the combined forces of Egypt, Syria and Jordan, seizing the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Arab armies were humiliated. President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the symbol of Arab pride, was devastated by the defeat. He died in 1970, leaving behind a bitter legacy and an unfinished dream to restore Arab honor and reclaim the land. His successor, Anwar Sadat, inherited a nation wounded, angry, and drowning in economic despair. Egypt's army had rebuilt, rearmed by the Soviet Union, but morale was fragile. Sadat knew that without a dramatic act, Egypt would remain trapped in humiliation. In Damascus, Hafez al-Assad, the new ruler of Syria, shared that burning desire for revenge. He had lost the Golan Heights, a plateau critical for Syria's security and pride. Assad wanted it back, no matter the cost. By 1973, both leaders were ready to gamble everything. The plan, the Egyptians called it Operation Badr. The Syrians, Operation Desert Storm, not the one from 1991, but an earlier, bloodier namesake. Their plan was audacious. On the afternoon of October 6th, as Israeli soldiers prayed in silence, 2 fronts would explode simultaneously. Egypt across the Suez Canal, Syria on the Golan Heights. The date was chosen with precision. Yom Kippur ensured Israeli forces would be unprepared, and it coincided with Ramadan, the Islamic month of fasting, giving the Arab troops a sense of divine purpose. By late September, intelligence signs were everywhere. Satellite photos showed Egyptian troop movements. Syrian tanks massed on the borders. But the Israeli intelligence establishment, riding high after 1967, was blinded by overconfidence. They believed no Arab leader would dare start a war Israel couldn't lose. They were wrong. The first hours of war, as the first shells landed, chaos erupted. Israeli officers scrambled to their bases, calling up reserves in panic. The Bar-Lev line, meant to withstand any assault for at least 48 hours, began collapsing within 6 hours. Egyptian commandos crossed the canal under a cover of anti-aircraft fire. They carried portable bridges, inflatable rafts, and flamethrowers. Within hours, they had breached the massive sand walls that lined the East Bank, walls that Israeli engineers had sworn would take days to penetrate. They did it using high-pressure water pumps, blasting through the sand like a knife through butter. It was a move no one in Israel had imagined possible. By nightfall, Egyptian forces had crossed in massive numbers, securing bridgeheads along a 100-kilometer front. The Israeli Southern Command, stunned and outnumbered, retreated in disarray. On the northern front, Syrian divisions stormed the Golan Heights. Their tanks roared through the hills, overwhelming the thin Israeli defenses. Within hours, they captured key outposts and were advancing toward the Jordan Valley, the last natural line before Israel's heartland. The panic in Tel Aviv Prime. Minister Golda Meir was awoken from her Yom Kippur rest with the words, "Madam Prime Minister, Egypt and Syria have attacked." Her response was simple. It's happened. The Israeli cabinet went into emergency session. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the hero of 1967, was shaken to the core. In the first 48 hours, his confidence crumbled. "The Third Temple is in danger," he whispered, a chilling metaphor for the possible destruction of Israel itself. The United States, caught off guard, watched with alarm. The Soviet Union, which had armed both Arab states, rushed to resupply them. The Cold War's shadow loomed over the Middle East once again. The turning tide begins. By the third day, Israeli reserves began arriving. Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, commanding a small force of tanks on the Golan, held off wave after wave of Syrian armor in a desperate stand now known as the Valley of Tears. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers died there, but so did thousands of Syrians. After days of relentless combat, the Syrian offensive stalled. Israeli forces pushed back, reclaiming lost ground and advancing deep into Syria. In the south, however, the picture was grim. Egyptian air defenses, the so-called missile umbrella, made Israeli airstrikes suicidal. Israeli pilots, once the kings of the sky, were suddenly falling from it. The war had entered a deadly stalemate. Sadat's strategy, victory without total victory. While the Israeli command focused on the tactical disaster, Sadat's true objective was already being achieved. He didn't need to destroy Israel. He only needed to prove that Israel could be hurt. In 1967, Arab soldiers had fled in chaos. In 1973, they stood their ground, fought bravely, and crossed the canal that had symbolized defeat. The psychological barrier was broken. Sadat's gamble worked. The Arab world saw Egypt not as a beaten nation, but as a resurrected one. For the first time in years, Cairo's streets erupted with joy. Crowds shouted, "Allahu Akbar," as they watched state television show Egyptian soldiers planting their flags on the Sinai sands. It didn't matter that the war was far from over. In that moment, Egypt had already reclaimed its pride. But pride comes at a price. In the next phase, Israel would regroup, counterattack, and strike deep into Egyptian territory. The fighting would become even bloodier, the diplomacy more dangerous, and the truth about victory more complicated than anyone imagined. For in war, victory is not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes it's forged in perception. To be continued, Part 2, The Counterstrike, Israel Strikes Back. Next, the shift in momentum, US and Soviet involvement, and how both sides began to claim triumph. First 72 hours of the Yom Kippur War were chaos. Israel, the nation that had stunned the world in 1967, with its lightning-fast triumph, now faced disaster everywhere. Confusion reigned, soldiers rushing from synagogues, untrained reserves thrown into battle, tanks without proper crews, air squadrons grounded by dense anti-aircraft fire. But by October 9th, something began to shift. The fear that had paralyzed Israel turned into fury. Reorganizing amid the fire, Israel's strength had always been its mobilization machine, a nation that could transform from peace to war in hours. And that's exactly what happened. Within days, 300,000 reservists were on the move. Convoys thundered down desert highways toward the Sinai and the Golan. Entire towns became ghost cities as men and women rushed to defend their country. General David Elazar, the chief of staff, ordered an immediate stabilization of the fronts. He knew one thing: if Israel couldn't regain control quickly, its survival might be questioned not only by its enemies, but by the world watching. By now, the United States had begun supplying intelligence and limited military aid. President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, wary of Soviet intervention, walked a diplomatic tightrope, but Israel's need for ammunition, spare parts, and tanks grew desperate. Behind the scenes, Operation Nickel Grass, an airlift of U.S. supplies, was being prepared. The first major turning point came in the north. For days, the Syrian army had poured through the Golan Heights, threatening to cut deep into northern Israel. Villages in the Galilee were already being evacuated. Israeli pilots, flying low through smoke and anti-aircraft fire, desperately bombed advancing Syrian columns. Then came one of the war's most legendary stands, the Valley of Tears. Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, commanding the 77th Armored Battalion, had fewer than 40 tanks against nearly 500 Syrian ones. His men were exhausted, running out of shells and cut off from reinforcements, but they refused to retreat. For 3 days, the valley turned into a furnace. Israeli and Syrian tanks clashed at point-blank range. Crews fought until their ammunition was gone, then used their machine guns, then their bare hands. At one point, Kahalani's radio went dead. He climbed onto his tank, scanning the horizon filled with fire and smoke, and shouted through the radio network, "No one moves back! We are the line!" By the morning of October 10th, the Syrian offensive collapsed. Dozens of burning tanks littered the battlefield. Israel had not only survived, it had stopped the Syrians cold. Now the tide began to turn. From defense to offense with the Golan front secured, Israeli forces counterattacked northward. In a matter of days, they pushed Syrian troops back beyond the 1967 ceasefire line and kept going. Israeli tanks rolled within artillery range of Damascus. The Syrian capital could hear the distant thunder of Israeli shells. Panic swept the city. Assad pleaded with Egypt to renew its assault in the south to relieve pressure. And that's exactly what Sadat did. The Sinai counterattack Egypt had achieved its initial goals, crossing the canal and restoring national pride. But when Syria began collapsing, Sadat ordered his army to go further, to push deeper into Sinai, to keep Israel off balance. His generals hesitated. They had warned him. The moment Egyptian forces moved beyond the protective range of their SAM missile umbrella, Israeli air power would strike with full fury. But Sadat insisted. On October 14th, the largest tank battle since World War II erupted in the sands of Sinai. More than 2,000 tanks clashed across a 100-mile front. The result was devastating for Egypt. The Israelis, led by Generals Ariel Sharon, Avraham Adnan, and Israel Tal, unleashed a counter-offensive that broke through the Egyptian lines. Within hours, the desert was filled with burning armor. Egyptian losses were catastrophic, more than 250 tanks destroyed in a single day, and then came Israel's boldest move yet. Crossing the Suez. The tables turned while Egyptian forces reeled from their failed offensive. Sharon spotted a weak point between Egypt's second and third armies. It was a gap, a small corridor left unguarded amid the chaos. Sharon proposed something audacious. Cross the canal into Egypt itself. On the night of October 15th, under cover of darkness, Israeli paratroopers slipped across the Suez Canal near Devasoir. They established a bridgehead on the western bank, the Egyptian side. It was an incredible reversal. Only a week earlier, Egyptians had crossed eastward in triumph. Now Israelis were crossing westward in vengeance. For the next 48 hours, engineers worked frantically under fire to build pontoon bridges. Sharon himself was nearly killed when his command tank took a direct hit. But the bridge held. Israeli armor streamed across, cutting deep into Egypt. Within days, they surrounded the Third Egyptian Army, trapping tens of thousands of soldiers east of the canal with dwindling supplies. The hunter had become the hunted. Moscow and Washington step in as Israeli forces advanced. The Soviet Union sounded the alarm. Moscow began threatening direct intervention to save Egypt's trapped army. Soviet paratroopers were reportedly put on standby. The United States, fearing a superpower confrontation, went on DEFCON 3, the highest alert since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy kicked into overdrive. He urgently pushed for a ceasefire, warning Israel that any deeper push toward Cairo could spark global catastrophe. Behind closed doors, Nixon's administration balanced between two goals: protecting Israel and avoiding World War III. By October 22nd, the United Nations, under US and Soviet pressure, passed Resolution 338, calling for an immediate ceasefire, but fighting continued for 2 more tense days. Both sides accused the other of violations. Israeli forces pushed even closer to Cairo. Egyptian soldiers, starving and encircled, faced annihilation. Finally, on October 25th, the guns fell silent, the battlefield of illusions. When the smoke cleared, both sides claimed victory. Israel had recovered from near disaster, surrounded an Egyptian army, and pushed to the gates of Damascus. Militarily, it was a triumph of resilience, but the cost was staggering. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers dead, more than in all previous wars combined. Egypt, though battered, emerged with something priceless: dignity. The image of Arab helplessness had been shattered. Egyptians had fought bravely, crossed the canal, and stood against the army that once humiliated them. For Sadat, that was victory enough. The price of power. The war had changed everything. The myth of Israeli invincibility was gone. The arrogance of its leadership had been exposed. For Egypt, the war transformed Sadat from a doubted leader into a national hero, paving the way for future peace talks that would reshape the Middle East. But for now, amid the sand and the smoke, the world asked the same question: who really won? By the final week of October 1973, the guns had gone silent, but the war was far from over. On paper, a ceasefire was in place. In reality, the Middle East was still burning, not with fire, but with pride, grief, and politics. What had begun as a war of tanks was turning into a war of words and diplomacy, a new battlefield where victory could be rewritten. Henry Kissinger's private jet cut across the Mediterranean skies. Below him, the Sinai was still littered with wreckage, charred tanks, abandoned rifles, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides. Kissinger knew this war could either plunge the superpowers into direct confrontation or become the foundation for peace. He chose the latter. But peace in the Middle East was never simple. It had to be negotiated like a minefield, carefully, step by step. In Cairo, Anwar Sadat's image filled every newspaper. The man who had once been dismissed as weak and uncertain was now hailed as a hero. "Egypt has crossed the canal," the headline screamed. It didn't matter that Israeli troops were now on Egyptian soil. To the Egyptian people, the canal had been crossed and honor restored. That alone was a revolution. For Sadat, that perception was power. He understood that military defeat could still become political victory if framed correctly. The Arab world had seen Egyptian courage, and that was enough to restore their pride. Meanwhile, in Israel, victory felt hollow. Families buried their sons. Thousands of soldiers were still missing, and the illusion of invincibility, the belief that the Israeli defense forces could never be caught off guard, had evaporated. Golda Meir, once regarded as the nation's Iron Mother, looked exhausted. The public demanded answers. How had their leaders failed to see it coming? How could they let their soldiers die so unprepared? Moshe Dayan, the one-eyed general whose image had symbolized the triumph of 1967, now found himself under attack from within. Newspapers questioned his judgment. Soldiers accused him of arrogance and blindness. The intelligence community, humiliated by its own complacency, faced a reckoning. In quiet conversations, officers whispered about the conceptia, the flawed belief that the Arabs would never dare start a war. That belief had nearly destroyed Israel. While Israel reeled internally, Kissinger began his famous shuttle diplomacy. He flew between Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem, sometimes visiting all 3 capitals within a single week. His goal was simple but daunting: prevent the Soviets from regaining dominance in the Arab world and secure a ceasefire that would stabilize the region. Kissinger admired Sadat's boldness. Sadat was pragmatic, unpredictable, and willing to make moves no Arab leader before him dared. When the two met privately, Sadat spoke not of vengeance, but of future peace. "We have fought," he said, "to open the road, not to close it." Kissinger listened carefully. He sensed that this was the opening Washington had long hoped for, an Arab leader who might be ready to break away from Moscow's orbit. In Tel Aviv, however, suspicion ran deep. Many Israeli ministers distrusted both Sadat and Kissinger. They feared the United States would pressure Israel into giving up hard-won territory. Ariel Sharon, now a war hero after leading the crossing of the canal, pushed for a more aggressive stance. He wanted to destroy the Egyptian Third Army completely, to end the war on Israel's terms. But Kissinger intervened. He warned that such a move would shatter American support and could trigger Soviet military action. Sharon was furious, but he obeyed. At the same time, the oil weapon had begun reshaping the world. In October, Arab oil-producing nations launched an embargo against Western countries that supported Israel, slashing production and driving global prices sky-high. Lines at gas stations stretched for miles. Economies trembled. For the first time, oil was a weapon more powerful than any tank. The war had spilled beyond the Middle East. It was now reshaping the global order. This gave the Arab side something Israel could never match: leverage. While Israeli soldiers bled on the battlefield, Arab nations used oil to pressure the world. Europe began rethinking its alliances. Even America, though firmly behind Israel, realized it had to balance its loyalty with realism. Kissinger understood. The key to peace would not be found in the desert, but in the corridors of power. As weeks passed, the tone of the war shifted from military to psychological. Israeli newspapers declared the war a miracle of survival, emphasizing how the IDF had turned defeat into victory. But deep down, the nation felt vulnerable. The funerals, the missing, the shock of being unprepared, they all left scars. The soldiers who returned from the front spoke less about heroism and more about loss. "We won," one veteran wrote in his diary, "but it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like survival." In Egypt, state media turned Sadat into a legend. Posters showed him pointing across the Suez Canal, his face lit with divine confidence. The propaganda was powerful, but Sadat's real genius lay in how he used his partial victory as a political springboard. He knew Egypt could not defeat Israel militarily, but by fighting and surviving, he had created the conditions for negotiation from a position of pride. He had turned humiliation into leverage. By late 1973, under American mediation, the disengagement agreements began to form. Israel agreed to pull back slightly from the west side of the canal, allowing Egypt to resupply its trapped Third Army. In return, Egypt would respect the ceasefire and begin indirect talks. It was the first small step towards something unthinkable: peace between Egypt and Israel. Behind every handshake and every headline, betrayal simmered. Syria felt abandoned by Egypt, accusing Sadat of negotiating too soon. Other Arab states whispered that he was selling out the Palestinian cause. But Sadat had made his choice. "I can wage war for 10 years, he told his advisors, "but what will Egypt gain? My people need bread, not glory." In Damascus, Hafez al-Assad stewed in silence. His army was bloodied, his pride shattered, and his ally in Cairo had turned toward Washington. The Arab front, once united, was now fractured. In Israel, political fractures deepened too. Golda Meir faced mass protests demanding her resignation. The Agranat Commission would soon investigate the government's failures, revealing shocking negligence in intelligence and readiness. Though Israel had survived, its political elite had been shaken to the core. Meir would step down within months. The war had spared the nation, but it had destroyed careers. Kissinger watched from the sidelines as the pieces fell into place. His shuttle diplomacy earned him international fame, but the real victory, if there was one, belonged to perception. Egypt had regained its pride. Israel had maintained its existence. America had tightened its grip on the region. And the Soviet Union, once the patron of Arab nationalism, began losing ground. Yet the most haunting truth was that neither side could truly celebrate. More than 20,000 soldiers were dead across all fronts. Cities were mourning, economies were broken, and the borders looked almost the same as before the first shot was fired. But the psychology of the region had changed forever. The Arabs no longer felt inferior. The Israelis no longer felt untouchable. And so the war ended, not with parades, but with silence, the kind that comes after a storm. When everyone is too tired to cheer, the question whispered through both Cairo and Jerusalem, through Washington and Moscow. If both sides claim victory, does that mean both sides lost something deeper? In the dim light of his office, Sadat wrote in his journal, "Victory is not what happens on the battlefield. Victory is when your enemy begins to think differently." He had achieved exactly that. To be continued. Part 4, Legacy of Fire, How the War Changed the Middle East Forever. The tide of the war began to shift, subtly at first, then decisively. By October 9th, Israeli intelligence realized something critical. The Egyptian forces were halting their advance. Their plan had never been to push deeper into the Sinai. They wanted to lure Israel into a trap, and for a time, it worked. But now, the momentum was beginning to turn. In the skies, Israel regained air superiority. The US began a massive airlift called Operation Nickel Grass, supplying Israel with F-4 Phantom parts, ammunition, and tanks. Soviet transports flew into Egypt and Syria with equal determination, dropping crates of missiles and T-62 tanks. The Middle East became the stage for a silent superpower proxy war, the US and the USSR playing chess through their allies' blood. Meanwhile, on the Golan Heights, General Moshe Peled led Israel's desperate northern counteroffensive. For days, Israeli tank crews fought outnumbered, 5-1. They slept in their tanks, faces blackened with soot, nerves raw. The Syrian armor had poured across the heights in waves. But by October 10th, Israeli reinforcements began to arrive. The line held. An Israeli tank commander named Avigdor Kahalani, who had been wounded in 1967, now led one of the most heroic stands in modern military history. His unit, the Valley of Tears Brigade, faced hundreds of Syrian tanks. One Israeli described it. "We could see the horizon burning, tanks exploding like suns, but we didn't move. We couldn't. After 3 days, the Syrians broke. The Israelis counterattacked, driving to within artillery range of Damascus itself. The tide had turned, but in the south, things were murkier. Egypt's army, still holding strong along the Suez Canal, believed the war could now end in their favor. They had achieved their initial objectives, crossing the canal, holding a defensive line. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat, however, wanted more. He demanded that his generals advance deeper into the Sinai, believing it would pressure Israel into negotiations from a position of weakness. His generals objected. "We are not ready," they warned. "If we leave the protection of our SAM, surface-to-air missile umbrella, the Israeli Air Force will destroy us," Sadat insisted. On October 14th, Egypt launched its ill-fated offensive eastward. It was the largest tank battle since World War II, over 2,000 tanks on the desert plain. Israeli gunners, hidden behind dunes, unleashed devastation. By sunset, 250 Egyptian tanks were burning wrecks. That same night, Israeli General Ariel Sharon, the bold and controversial commander of the Armored Reserve, saw an opening. His scouts had found a gap, a seam between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies near the Great Bitter Lake. Sharon proposed a daring maneuver, cross the Suez Canal into Egyptian territory. It was madness. It was genius. Over the next days, the Israelis launched Operation Stout-Hearted Men. Under heavy fire, Israeli paratroopers crossed the canal on rafts, securing a bridgehead on the western bank, Egyptian soil. Within hours, engineers built pontoon bridges. Israeli tanks rolled across. Suddenly, the war had reversed direction. Now it was Egypt's armies that were trapped, their supply lines severed. Cairo panicked. Soviet advisors fled. Sadat begged Moscow for direct intervention, even hinting at nuclear support. Meanwhile, in Israel, the public mood shifted from despair to grim triumph. Prime Minister Golda Meir, who had been crushed under the weight of the early defeats, now faced the opposite problem: an international demand for restraint. The United States feared total Egyptian collapse could draw the Soviets into direct confrontation. On October 22nd, the United Nations passed Resolution 338, calling for a ceasefire. Both sides accepted in theory. In practice, the fighting continued for 2 more tense days. Israeli forces encircled the Egyptian Third Army entirely, cutting it off from food and water. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers were stranded in the desert, surrounded, their fate uncertain. The world stood on the brink. The Soviet Union put its airborne divisions on alert. The US raised its nuclear forces to DEFCON 3, the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. For one terrifying night, the Yom Kippur War threatened to ignite World War III. But diplomacy prevailed. On October 25, 1973, the guns fell silent. The ceasefire held. The war, short, brutal, and transformative, was over. Yet when the dust settled, one question remained unanswered: who had actually won? Egypt had restored its pride. The crossing of the Suez was an undeniable psychological victory. For the first time, Egyptian soldiers had held their ground against Israel. The Arab world saw it as redemption after 1967. Israel, meanwhile, had pushed back its enemies on both fronts and surrounded the Egyptian army. Militarily, it was a triumph, but at what cost? Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers were dead. For a country so small, it was a national trauma. The victory felt hollow, and beneath the politics, something deeper was shifting. In the streets of Tel Aviv, parents mourned sons. In Cairo, Sadat realized the war had given him leverage, a chance to open negotiations with the West. In Moscow and Washington, both superpowers had stared into the abyss and stepped back. The war had changed everything, not just borders, but belief itself. In the final chapter, the story of what happened after the war, the betrayals, the peace, and the secrets that would take decades to reveal who truly claimed victory. The Yom Kippur War was not just a clash of armies. It was a clash of pride, prophecy, and power. In only 19 days, it changed the Middle East forever. Egypt called it redemption, Israel called it survival, and the superpowers called it a warning. In the silence after the last gunfire, both sides claimed victory, but neither emerged the same. The war that began on the holiest day in Israel ended as a turning point for the entire world. Because sometimes, the real victory is not on the battlefield, it's in what comes after. This was the Yom Kippur War. Who really claims victory? If you found this story powerful, like, comment, and subscribe for more real history that still shapes our world today.